the most substantial expansion of federal higher education investment since Lyndon Johnson's Higher Education Act of 1965. The bill remained, as Sanders himself had acknowledged in a statement to Common Dreams in May of 2025, certain not to pass the Republican-controlled Congress. The bill remained, in his own framing, an alternative vision rather than a legislative likelihood. He had introduced it because the introduction was the position. The position was the argument. The argument had been the same for 45 years. He was now in the Dirksen Senate Office Building, room 430, on the morning of April 10, 2026, presiding as the ranking member of a Senate Help Committee oversight hearing titled Higher Education, Affordability, and Federal Investment Outcomes. It was called by Chairman Bill Cassidy of Louisiana for the specific purpose of examining the empirical record of state-level free college and tuition reduction programs that had been operating in the United States across the preceding decade and the implications of that record for the federal-level College for All framework. Linda McMahon, the Secretary of Education of the United States, had been invited to testify in her capacity as the cabinet officer with constitutional and statutory responsibility for federal higher education policy implementation, and she had accepted with the specific, organized, business executive readiness of a person who had been preparing for this exchange for the entirety of the 8 months she had held the office. Linda McMahon was 77 years old. She had been born Linda Marie Edwards on October 4, 1948, in New Bern, North Carolina, the only child of Evelyn and Henry Edwards, both of whom had been employees at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, the military installation that anchored the small eastern North Carolina coastal economy in which she had grown up. Her father had been an electrician at the air station. Her mother had been an administrative employee. The family had been working class, conservative Baptist, and committed to the specific, quiet, unornamented values of mid-century rural American military families. She had met Vince McMahon when she was 13 years old. She had married him in 1966, 4 months after her high school graduation, when she was 17. She had attended East Carolina University and had earned a Bachelor of Arts in French in 1969, the first in her family to complete a college education. She had earned a teaching certificate but had never taught. She had worked as a paralegal in the early years of her marriage, while her husband cycled through a series of jobs, and the McMahons had declared bankruptcy in 1976. That was the specific, documented, working-class economic experience that had organized her subsequent business career around an almost theological commitment to operational discipline and against the specific, expansionary, optimistic financial assumptions that produce institutional collapse when the assumptions encounter the actual conditions of the economy. She and Vince had founded Titan Sports in 1980 and built it into World Wrestling Entertainment, the multi-billion-dollar global sports entertainment company that she had served as CEO of from 1997 to 2009. She had run for Senate in Connecticut twice, in 2010 and 2012, losing both times. It was the specific, painful, expensive electoral experience that had given her a more granular understanding of public opinion and political coalition mechanics than most cabinet secretaries enter their offices possessing. She had served as administrator of the Small Business Administration during the first Trump administration. She had been confirmed as Secretary of Education on March 3, 2025, by a 51-45 Senate vote, and Bernie Sanders had been one of the 45 votes against her, having stated on the Senate floor and in subsequent ABC News interviews that her confirmation could be potentially devastating for working-class Americans. She had read those statements. She had not forgotten them. She had also not been wounded by them in the way that a person less metabolically prepared for adversarial public proceedings would have been wounded by them. She had been in the public arena for 16 years at the moment of her confirmation, and she had developed the specific, hard, unsentimental, organized professional patience that survives that kind of arena across that length of time. She walked into the Dirksen Senate Office Building, room 430, on April 10th, 2026, with a folder containing the specific, documented empirical data that she had assembled over the preceding 3 weeks in preparation for the moment that the hearing was about to produce. The room was Dirksen 430, the Senate Help Committee's primary hearing room, and by 9 o'clock on the morning of April 10th, the gallery was at capacity, and the press section was at the density that communicated historical significance. The cameras were at their stations, and the overhead lighting was the flat, document-grade brightness that Senate hearing rooms maintain for the permanent record. The stenographer was at her machine. The committee members were arriving at the dais and taking their seats with the practiced, slightly distracted movement of legislators who had attended hundreds of similar hearings, and who knew that the morning's significance would be measured not by the procedural events, but by the specific exchanges that the hearing produced between the two principals on opposite sides of the witness table. In the third row of the gallery, in the right center seat, was a young man named Andre Ramirez. He was 26 years old, a former Excelsior Scholarship recipient at the State University of New York at Buffalo, who had enrolled in the program in the fall of 2018 with the specific, transformative expectation that the New York State Free College Program, announced by Governor Andrew Cuomo in 2017, would provide him with a tuition-free pathway to a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, and who had, in the spring of 2021, dropped out at the end of his junior year, 54 credits short of degree completion, with $11,400 in unpaid fees and incidental costs that the Excelsior Scholarship had not covered. He had a documented lived experience of what the gap between the announcement of free college and the operational delivery of free college had cost him in the specific years when the cost had affected the trajectory of his actual life. He had grown up in the Bronx, the son of Dominican immigrants, the first in his family to attend college. He was the kind of student whose enrollment in a SUNY engineering program represented exactly the demographic and educational outcome that the Excelsior Scholarship's authors had identified as the program's central justification. He had enrolled in 2018 the program and had paid his tuition. The program had not paid his fees, which at SUNY Buffalo amounted to approximately $11,700 per semester. The program had not paid his housing, which at SUNY Buffalo amounted to approximately $9,200 per academic year. The program had not paid his books, which in mechanical engineering ran to approximately $1,400 per academic year. The program required him to remain in New York State for the equivalent number of years after graduation that he had received the scholarship, with the penalty for departure being the conversion of the scholarship to a loan. The program required him to maintain continuous full-time enrollment, with the penalty for any semester of part-time status being the loss of scholarship eligibility for the remaining academic career. The program required him to complete his degree within 4 years, with the penalty for any extension being the loss of scholarship eligibility. He had worked 30 hours per week at a campus dining services job to cover the fees and housing and books that the scholarship did not cover. In the spring semester of his junior year, his mother had been diagnosed with a severe health challenge in the Bronx, and he had reduced his enrollment from 15 credits to 12 to be able to drive home on weekends to be with her. And the credit reduction had triggered the part-time status threshold, and the part-time status threshold had triggered the scholarship loss. And the scholarship loss had converted his accumulated scholarship into a loan. And the loan, combined with the fees and housing and books he had been covering at 30 hours per week, had become unmanageable. and he had withdrawn at the end of the spring 2021 semester with 54 credits and $11,400 in debt and no degree. He was now 26 years old. He worked as a service technician at an HVAC company in Yonkers. He had testified before a New York State Senate Education Subcommittee in 2023 about the operational mechanics of Excelsior-S structural design and the gap between the announcement and the experience. He had written to Bernie Sanders' Senate office in March of 2024, describing his experience and asking what the College for All Act structural design had learned from Excelsior-S operational outcomes. He had received a form letter. He had written again in October of 2024 with the same question. He had received another form letter. He had driven from Yonkers to Washington at the invitation of the committee's majority staff. He had a folder. The folder contained the original Excelsior Award letter from 2018, the credit reduction notification from spring 2021, the loan conversion notice, the $11,400 withdrawal balance, and a one-page handwritten summary of what the experience had taught him about the structural difference between announcing free college and actually delivering free college to the specific working families. The announcements were addressed to Chairman Bill Cassidy gave the session to order at 10:00 and recognized Sanders for opening remarks. Sanders adjusted his microphone with the practiced, unhurried movement of a man who had been adjusting Senate hearing room microphones since 2007 and who had no remaining anxiety about the proceeding, because the proceeding was, in its essential structure, the same proceeding he had been participating in for 19 years. He said, Chairman Cassidy, Secretary McMahon, members of the committee. He said it in the specific, flat-weathered, Brooklyn, Vermont voice that had become, across 45 years, one of the most recognizable instruments in American political communication. He said, I want to begin by stating clearly what is at stake in the discussion this committee is about to have. He said, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, more than 45 million Americans owe close to $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. He said, the average graduate of a 4-year public university leaves school with $30,000 in debt. He said, many graduates leave with $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 in debt. He said this debt is delaying home ownership, delaying marriage, delaying family formation, delaying small business creation, delaying every piece of economic participation that the American economy depends on for its growth and renewal. He said, it is a moral crisis. He said, it is an economic crisis. He said, and it is entirely unnecessary in a country that spends $1 trillion per year on its military, and that gave Wall Street a several trillion-dollar bailout in 2008 with no comparable public benefit, and that continues to allow billionaires to pay lower effective tax rates than the working people who clean their offices. He said the College for All Act of 2025 addresses this crisis directly. He said it makes public 4-year colleges and universities tuition-free for households earning up to $300,000. He said it makes community colleges tuition-free for everyone. He said it cancels the entire $1.6 trillion in outstanding student debt for the 45 million Americans who carry it. He said it caps student loan interest rates at 1.88%. He said it triples Pell Grant funding for low-income students. He said it provides $1.3 billion per year for historically black colleges and universities and Hispanic-serving institutions and tribal colleges. He said, and it pays for all of this through a Wall Street speculation tax that, according to the published economic analysis, will raise $220 billion per year, or $2.2 trillion over 10 years. He said the bill is paid for. He said the math works. He said the question is not whether the country can afford it. He said the question is whether the country has the political will to demand that Wall Street pay a small share of what it has extracted from working families for the past 40 years. He said it with the full, weathered, 4-5-year force of a man who has been making this argument long enough to be the argument's living embodiment in the United States Senate, and who has made it in enough rooms to know that the most effective version of the argument is the version that begins with the math. McMahon adjusted her microphone. She said, "Chairman Cassidy, Senator Sanders, members of the committee." She said it in the specific, controlled, professionally calibrated voice of a woman who had run a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company for 2 decades and who had developed across that experience the executive habit of beginning adversarial proceedings with a clear, organized framing of the argument she intended to make and the evidence she intended to present in support of it. She said, "I want to begin by acknowledging directly what Senator Sanders has correctly identified, which is that the cost of higher education in the United States has grown faster than median household income for 40 consecutive years, that the burden of student debt is a real burden borne by real families, and that the political popularity of the College for All framework reflects the genuine, documented anxiety that millions of American households feel about whether higher education remains accessible to their children." She said, "I do not contest the existence of the problem." She said, "I want to engage with the specific empirical question of whether the College for All Act, in its current structural design and at its current proposed funding level, would actually solve the problem it is addressed to, or whether it would create a different and equally serious problem in the form of a fiscal commitment whose mathematical assumptions do not survive contact with the operational data that state-level versions of the program have generated over the preceding decade." She said it with the flat, organized, executive precision of a person who has come to a hearing prepared not to attack the bill's principles, but to examine the bill's arithmetic in the empirical light of what the experimental versions had produced. She said Senator Sanders has cited the figure of $2.2 trillion over 10 years as the cost of the College for All Act. She said that figure appears in his own published fact sheet. She said, "I want to be precise about what that figure represents and what it does not represent." She said $2.2 trillion is the federal share of the program's cost over 10 years, not the total cost of eliminating tuition and fees at all, participating public colleges and universities. She said the federal share under the bill's structural design is 67% of total tuition elimination costs, with states covering the remaining 33%. She said the total cost of tuition elimination over 10 years, when the state share is added to the federal share, is approximately $3.3 trillion. She said that figure does not include the $1.6 trillion in student debt cancellation that the bill also proposes. She said that figure does not include the increased Pell Grant funding, the work-study expansion, the HBCU funding, the Gear Up expansion, or the institutional grants that the bill also proposes. She said the actual total 10-year fiscal commitment of the College for All Act of 2025, accounting for all components, is between $4.7 trillion and $5.2 trillion. She said that is more than twice the figure Senator Sanders has cited as the bill's cost. She said that is the documented total before we begin examining whether the proposed funding mechanism, the Wall Street speculation tax, can actually generate the revenue Senator Sanders projects. She said, "I want to address the funding mechanism directly." She said the Sanders fact sheet projects that a 0.5% tax on stock trades, a 0.1% tax on bonds, and a 0.005% tax on derivatives will raise $220 billion per year. She said the Joint Committee on Taxation has examined similar financial transaction tax proposals and produced revenue estimates that consistently fall below Senator Sanders' published figure. She said the Tax Policy Center, in its 2019 analysis of a similar Sanders proposal, estimated annual revenue between $75 billion and $130 billion, depending on behavioral assumptions about how Wall Street trading volumes would respond to the tax. She said the European Union's experience with comparable financial transaction taxes, particularly the French and Italian versions implemented in 2012 and 2013 respectively, has shown that trading volumes decline by approximately 20 to 40% in response to the tax, with corresponding reductions in expected revenue. She said the actual 10-year revenue projection for the Wall Street speculation tax, using the more conservative behavioral assumptions that the international experience supports, is between $750 billion and $1.3 trillion over 10 years. She said that is between 34 and 59% of the program's stated cost. She said, not the bill's total cost of $4.7 to $5.2 trillion. She said, the federal share alone of $2.2 trillion. She said the funding mechanism, by the most realistic available estimate, covers approximately one-half of the federal share of the program. She said the remaining federal share, between $900 billion and $1.4 trillion, has no identified funding source in the bill. She said it with the flat, patient, evidentiary precision of a person who has spent 3 weeks reviewing the relevant fiscal analyses with her department's research staff and who is now delivering the synthesis with the specific, organized, executive calm that adversarial proceedings reward. In the third row, Andre Ramirez sat with the folder in his lap, and the specific, attentive 26-year-old. Focus of a person who had been waiting to hear this part of the morning's exchange, because the operational reality of the program he had been enrolled in had taught him that the gap between the announced cost and the delivered cost was the gap that determined whether the program actually served the people it was addressed to. Sanders said, Secretary McMahon, the cost figures you have cited are higher than the figures that have been generally accepted in the legislative analysis of this bill, and I would welcome the opportunity to examine your sources in detail. He said, I want to address the more fundamental point you have made, which is that the funding mechanism is allegedly insufficient to support the program's full cost. He said, I want to note that the Wall Street speculation tax has been examined by multiple economists and that the $220 billion per year figure reflects the assessment of credible analysts, including economists at the Roosevelt Institute and the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He said, I do not accept the framing that the realistic projection is the lower projection. He said, I accept that there is a range of estimates and that the lower end of the range produces a smaller revenue figure. He said, I also note that the country found ways to fund the 2017 tax cuts for billionaires, the trillion-dollar increases in the military budget, and the unfunded wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, none of which had identified funding mechanisms before they were enacted. He said when the political will exists to fund a program, the country finds the funding. He said when the political will does not exist, the country produces detailed analyses about why the funding is allegedly inadequate. He said it with the genuine, weathered, 4 or 5 year force of a man who has been hearing the same affordability arguments deployed against the same progressive priorities for the entirety of his political career and who has watched those arguments deployed selectively against the priorities he supports, while being conspicuously absent from discussions of priorities he opposes. McMahon said, Senator Sanders, I accept the political will, framing as a legitimate argument, and I want to engage with the specific empirical evidence that I believe is most relevant to whether the College for All structure actually delivers the outcomes the program is designed to deliver. She said, New York State implemented the Excelsior Scholarship Program in 2017 to provide tuition-free public higher education for in-state students from households earning up to $125,000. She said Massachusetts implemented the Mass Grant Plus program in 2018 with comparable structural design. She said Tennessee implemented the Tennessee Promise program for community college tuition in 2014. She said these state-level experiments have generated nearly a decade of operational outcome data that this committee can examine to assess whether the College for All structural design produces the educational outcomes it promises. She said, I want to share what that data shows. She said New York's Excelsior Scholarship has been operational for 9 years. She said in its first year, 2017, the program received approximately 75,000 applications. She said the program awarded approximately 20,000 scholarships. She said the gap between application and award reflected the program's eligibility requirements, which excluded students whose family income was too high, students who were not enrolled full-time, students who were not on track to complete in 4 years, students who could not commit to the in-state residency requirement after graduation, and students whose tuition was already covered by other financial aid sources. She said in subsequent years, the application to award gap has remained substantial. She said as of fiscal year 2024, Excelsior covered approximately 22,000 SUNY and CUNY students per year, out of approximately 400,000 total enrolled students. She said that is approximately 5.5% of the eligible student population. She said the program has covered tuition. She said it has not covered fees, housing, books, transportation, or any of the non-tuition costs that constitute, in current SUNY and CUNY pricing structures, between 60 and 70% of the total cost of attendance for resident students. She said the New York State Higher Education Services Corporation, as 2023 program evaluation, found that Excelsior recipients' 4-year graduation rate was 51%, which is comparable to the system-wide 4-year graduation rate of 52% for non-Excelsior recipients. She said the program did not improve graduation outcomes. She said it shifted the financial structure of attendance for the students it covered. She said the program's impact on overall higher education access in New York State has been documented as approximately a 3% increase in SUNY and CUNY enrollment compared to pre-program levels after adjusting for demographic and economic trends. She said, that is the empirical record. She said it is in the public domain. She said it has been published by the New York State Higher Education Services Corporation, the Brookings Institution, the Urban Institute, and the National Bureau of Economic Research. She said, I have it in this folder. She said, I am ready to enter it into the record of this hearing. She said, I want to add the data from Massachusetts and Tennessee, because the New York data is not an outlier. She said the Massachusetts Mass Grant Plus program, implemented in 2018 with comparable structural design, has demonstrated similar outcome patterns. She said the program covered approximately 15,000 students per year out of approximately 120,000 state university and community college enrollees. She said the program's 4-year graduation rate for recipients was 47%, compared to a state university system average of 49% for non-recipients. She said the program's enrollment impact in Massachusetts state universities was approximately 2% above the demographic-adjusted baseline. She said the Massachusetts state share of program costs grew from $24 million in fiscal year 2019 to $116 million in fiscal year 2025, a 383% increase that significantly exceeded the program's original 5-year cost projections. She said the cost growth has produced sustained budgetary pressure on the Commonwealth's higher education funding allocations and has prompted ongoing legislative debate about whether the program is fiscally sustainable in its current form. She said the Tennessee Promise program for community college tuition has been operational for 12 years. She said it has the longest operational track record of any state-level free college program in the United States. She said in its first cohort, 2015, Tennessee Promise enrolled approximately 58,000 students. She said of that cohort, the 3-year community college graduation rate was 26%. She said the 6-year transfer to bachelor's degree completion rate, the metric that measures whether community college served as the intended pathway to a 4-year degree, was 18%. She said the program has remained popular politically and has continued to receive bipartisan support in the Tennessee legislature. She said it has not produced the educational attainment improvements that the program's original justifications projected. She said the empirical record across 3 states, with structurally distinct versions of the free college framework, New York focused on 4-year tuition, Massachusetts on grant supplements, Tennessee on community college first-dollar coverage, converges on a consistent pattern. The programs reduce financial costs for the students they cover. They do not significantly improve graduation rates. They cover smaller percentages of the eligible population than the announcement suggested, and their state-level fiscal commitments grow faster than the original cost projections. She said, that is the empirical record. She said, I want this committee to engage with that record before we expand the framework to the federal level at a 4.7 to 5.2 trillion fiscal commitment. She said it with the flat, complete, executive precision of a person who has assembled the empirical evidence from 3 operational test cases and who is now putting all 3 into the permanent record of the Senate Help Committee. She said, Andre Ramirez is in the 3rd row of this gallery. She said it with the flat, patient, evidentiary quiet with which she said the names that mattered. She said Andre is 26 years old. She said he grew up in the Bronx. She said his parents are Dominican immigrants. She said he was the first in his family to attend college. She said he enrolled at SUNY Buffalo in fall 2018 as an Excelsior Scholarship recipient, majoring in mechanical engineering. She said in spring 2021, his mother was diagnosed with a severe health challenge. She said Andre reduced his course load from 15 credits to 12 credits in order to drive home to the Bronx on weekends to be with her. She said the credit reduction triggered the Excelsior part-time status threshold. She said the part-time status triggered the loss of scholarship eligibility. She said the scholarship loss converted his accumulated awards into a loan. She said Andre withdrew at the end of spring 2021 with 54 credits, $11,400 in debt, and no degree. She said in March 2024, he wrote to Senator Sanders' office, describing this experience and asking what the College for All Act's structural design had learned from Excelsior's operational outcomes. She said he wrote again in October 2024 with the same question. She said he received 2 form letters. She said he drove from Yonkers to Washington to be in this hearing today because he believed his experience contained empirical information about the gap between the announcement of free college and the operational delivery of free college, and he believed the committee, considering the federal expansion of the program, needed that empirical information in the record. She said, I am asking him to be in the record. She said it without elevation, without theatrical pause, with the flat, complete, executive precision of a person noting what the public record now contained. In the 3rd row, Andre Ramirez sat with the folder, and the Excelsior award letter, and the credit reduction notification, and the loan conversion notice, and the $11,400 withdrawal balance, and the handwritten summary on the one page. He was not crying. He was not angry. He was present with the complete, focused, 6-year-old attention of a young man who had spent 4 years processing what had happened in his life and who had decided, in the months after his testimony before the New York State Senate Subcommittee in 2023, that the operational reality of his experience contained empirical information that the institutional decision-makers needed, regardless of whether they wanted to hear it. Sanders was very still. The specific, genuine, weathered stillness of an 4-year-old man who had been making the same argument for 45 years, and who had just received an empirical examination of the operational outcomes of the experimental versions of his argument that he could not categorically dismiss, because the data points were specific and the outcomes were documented. And the young man in the third row was specifically and personally the kind of person whose experience he had spent his career claiming to represent. He said, "Andre." He said the name with the full, genuine, biographical weight of a man from Brooklyn who had spent his entire political career fighting for the working-class families, whose children had to figure out how to attend college without the institutional cushioning that wealthier families took for granted. He said, "I want to speak to you directly, because I believe you came to this room for a direct response, and I owe you one." He said, "The experience you have described is real." He said the structural problems with Excelsior are real. He said the gap between the announcement and the operational delivery is real. He said the College for All Act of 2025 was designed to address some of those gaps by covering all costs of attendance, not just tuition, but I will acknowledge directly that the bill's funding mechanism, as I have proposed it, may not generate the full revenue needed to support the operational delivery of those expanded coverage commitments at the scale the program promises. He said, "I will further acknowledge that the form letters you received were not the response your specific question deserved." He said, "Your question was a substantive question about the structural design of the bill and the operational lessons of the state-level experiments, and it deserved a substantive answer rather than a constituent services template." He said, "The form letters were a failure of my office engagement with a constituent who had specific professional knowledge about the program's operational outcomes." He said it with the genuine, hard-weathered honesty of a man who had built his career on the principle that institutions in power should account directly to the people they serve, and who understood in this moment that the principle applied to him as completely as it applied to the institutions he had spent his career criticizing. McMahon said, "Senator Sanders, the acknowledgement you have just made is in the record." She said the Excelsior structural problems are real. She said the funding mechanism may not generate the full revenue. She said the form letters were a failure of office engagement. She said those 3 acknowledgments matter, and the record holds them. She said, "And I want to place beside them the specific number that this hearing has been organized around." She said, $2.2 trillion. She said $2.2 trillion is the federal share of a program whose total 10-year cost is $4.7 to $5.2 trillion, and whose proposed funding mechanism, by the most realistic available estimate, generates between $750 billion and $1.3 trillion. She said the gap between what the program promises and what its funding mechanism can deliver is between $900 billion and $1.4 trillion before we add in the additional components of the bill. She said that gap, in the operational reality of state-level experiments like Excelsior, is the gap that converts from a federal commitment into a state commitment, and from a state commitment into a fee structure, and from a fee structure into the kind of operational compromise that produces the outcome Andre Ramirez has described. She said, "The math does not just affect a fiscal projection," she said, "the math affects the actual student in the actual program, who actually has to choose between completing his coursework on the schedule the program requires and being with his mother during her intensive treatments." She said it with the flat, complete, executive precision of a person who had organized the hearing around the specific point where the abstract becomes operational and who had now arrived at that point with the empirical evidence and the human anchor and the documented gap fully assembled in the room. The room held the specific silence that comes when a hearing has arrived at the moment its preparation has been organized around. The press section was very still. The cameras had not moved. The stenographer was typing. The gavel fell at 1246. In the third row, Andre Ramirez stood with the folder and walked toward the gallery exit. The aide from the majority staff said, "Senator Sanders said your form letters were a failure of office engagement." Ramirez said, "Yes." The aide said, "Was that what you came for?" Ramirez thought about this with a methodical, unhurried patience of a young man who had spent the 4 years since his withdrawal learning how to think about the operational reality of institutions rather than the announcements they produced. He said, "I came because the gap between the announcement and the delivery is the gap that determines whether the program actually serves the people the announcement is addressed to." He said, "I needed that gap to be in the permanent record of a federal hearing." He said, "It's there now." He said, "The acknowledgement doesn't give me back the 54 credits, or the 4 years, or the 11,400, or the degree I would have completed in 2022 if the program had been structurally designed for the operational reality of working-class students." He said it does mean that the federal version of the program now has to engage with the operational reality of the state versions before the federal version is enacted, because the record holds what happened. He said, "That is the only thing the record can do." He said the record is what it is. He walked toward the elevator. He had a flight home to Yonkers in the morning. He had a client meeting at the HVAC company on Monday. He had the folder and the $11,400 and the documented record of what the program had taught him about the difference between the announcement and the delivery. The record holds it now. He went home. Sanders walked toward the minority members' exit at 1253. He was 84 years old, and he had been making the same argument for 45 years, and he had just made it in a Senate Help Committee hearing room across the table from a Secretary of Education who had assembled the empirical evidence from the state-level versions and had laid it on the table with the flat executive precision that the evidence required. He had acknowledged the gaps. He had acknowledged the form letters. He had not retreated from the argument as principle, which was that public colleges and universities in the wealthiest country in the history of the world should be accessible to working-class families without the burden of debt. He still believed it. He would keep believing it for as long as he held office, and for as long as he lived, which was approximately the same period at this point. The record held the principle, and it held the operational complications, and it held Andre Ramirez and the $11,400. All of it was there. He walked. The argument had been the same for 45 years. The argument was correct in its principle and operationally complicated in its execution. And both of those things were always going to be true simultaneously. And the question was whether the principle and the complications could be reconciled in legislation that survived contact with the operational reality of working-class students. The morning had not produced that reconciliation. The morning had produced the acknowledgement that the reconciliation was the work that remained. He walked toward the building exit. The work remained. It always had. McMahon walked out through the executive corridor at 1:00. She had a meeting with the department's higher education policy team at 2:30 and a press conference scheduled for 4:00. She had organized the morning's hearing around the specific point where the College for All Framework's mathematical assumptions encountered the operational reality of state-level implementations, and the morning had produced exactly the exchange the preparation had been organized to produce. The $2.2 trillion was in the record. The total cost of $4.7 to $5.2 trillion was in the record. The funding gap of $900 billion to $1.4 trillion was in the record. The Excelsior application to award gap, and the four-year graduation parity, and the fee, and housing, and book gaps, and the structural mechanics that had converted Andre Ramirez's scholarship into a loan during his mother's intensive treatments were all in the record. The acknowledgement that the form letters had been a failure was in the record. She had not destroyed Bernie Sanders. She had not been trying to destroy Bernie Sanders. She had been trying to put the operational mathematics of the College for All Act into the permanent record of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in a form precise enough that the framework as subsequent legislative development would have to engage with the mathematics directly. The record held the mathematics now. That was what the morning had been organized to produce. She had produced it. The work continued. Some hearings produced the conversion of an aspirational framework into an empirical examination. The McMahon-Sanders exchange on the morning of April 10, 2026, in Dirksen 430, produced that kind of conversion. It produced it without theatricality, without personal attack, without the rhetorical excess that hearings on contested policy frameworks frequently produce. It produced it through the assembly of the documented data from the state-level experiments and the introduction of the specific human anchor whose experience contained the operational mathematics in living form, and through the specific executive precision with which Linda McMahon delivered the synthesis. The College for All framework as a moral aspiration remained the morning's most consistent and most genuinely defended position. The College for All framework as an operational program with specific funding requirements and specific structural mechanics remained subject to the specific empirical examination that the morning had produced. Those two things were both in the record now. Andre Ramirez drove home to Yonkers. He had the folder. The HVAC company had a client meeting on Monday. The record holds it all. The work that remains is the work of reconciling the principle with the operational mathematics in legislation that survives contact with the realities of working-class students who reduce their course loads when their mothers face a severe health challenge. That work continues. The record holds the gap. The gap is the obligation. The obligation belongs to the people who hold the gavels and write the legislation. The work remains. The record holds it. That is what the record is for. That is what it has always been for. The College for All framework had been Sanders' signature higher education proposal across 45 years. The empirical record from the state-level versions had been compiled across the same period that the federal proposal had been continuously reintroduced. The two had not been brought into direct contact in a federal hearing room, with the operational synthesis fully assembled until the morning of April 10, 2026. They were now in the same record. The principle and the operational mathematics existed simultaneously, neither dominating the other, both available to the legislative process that would eventually decide what the federal framework's structural design should look like. The acknowledgement that the form letters had failed Andre Ramirez was in the record. The acknowledgement that the funding mechanism might not generate full revenue was in the record. The acknowledgement that the structural mechanics had produced specific operational failures was in the record. The Excelsior numbers and the Mass Grant numbers and the Tennessee Promise numbers were in the record. The $11,400 was in the record. The medical treatments were in the record. The credit reduction was in the record. The withdrawal was in the record. The 54 credits, without a degree, were in the record. All of it was now permanent in the form that hearing transcripts produce when the gavel comes down, and the document moves from the present tense of a proceeding into the permanent tense of accountability. The work that remains is the work of building federal legislation that engages with the empirical record that the morning produced. That work belongs to the people who hold the gavels in subsequent Congresses, and to the constituencies who pressure them, and to the institutional analysts who provide the technical estimates, and to the operational practitioners who implement whatever framework eventually moves from proposal to enactment. The Morning S record is the foundation on which that work has to build. The principle is real. The operational mathematics are real. The young man in the third row was real. His mother's medical treatments were real. The $11,400 was real. The 54 credits and the missing degree are real. All of it has to fit into legislation that survives contact with the operational reality of working-class students whose lives do not pause when the program's structural mechanics encounter them. That is the work. The morning produced the foundation for the work. The work continues. It always has. The record holds the foundation. That is what the record is for. That is what it has always been.